everybody. His new book, Privateers and Pine Robbers, Coastal New Jersey. It's been out for just a little while. I had an opportunity to read it. It's an awesome book. I believe it's going to be one of the definitive books for future generations for researching our Revolutionary War history in South Jersey here. He had books here to sell and autograph after the meeting, and he's done speaking. Bob's a retired college administrator from the College of New Jersey, or as I call it, Trenton State. He's a lifelong historian. He's been interested in history his whole life. And this book is really well documented, too. When you start reading it, you'll see what I'm talking about. And it's a perfect timing for America 250 and the Revolution. Yesterday, when we were up in Newark, Tim and I always have a running joke with Roger Williams, because Roger Williams talks about it as the 10 crucial days and nothing else exists in the state. Well, we always talk about South Jersey and the two New Jerseys, and that was actually a topic at lunch yesterday, the two New Jerseys. And we're in the other New Jersey. That doesn't really get mentioned that much a lot of times as far as nationally in the American Revolution. And one of the key things that happened here was privateering. And it was one of the crucial things that won the war. We really didn't have a great Navy, because if you wanted to be in the Navy, you became a privateer because you could make money. If you went into the Navy, you were just getting paid in colonial scrip. So most of the people, the good sailors, were in the privateers. And so, this is one of the topics we always like to talk about here in Colonel Richard Summers' chapter. It involves a lot of our people. Chestnut Neck is one of the prime examples of that. Tuckerton and other areas. So anyway, without further ado, Bob is going to talk about the Admiralty and a Scandal in Egg Harbor, which is included in this book. So, Bob?
Thank you very much, Mike. When I was first contacted to come to speak to this group, I was sort of very motivated to do that, because this group will probably be more knowledgeable about the people and the places that I'm going to be speaking about tonight. When I grew up in South Jersey at the Jersey Shore in Cape May County at a town called Avalon, which some of you may be familiar with. As a boy, I was always interested in local history. And then during the bicentennial of the American Revolution, my wife and I were founding members of a reenactment group called the Egg Harbor Guard. And we modeled ourselves after Colonel Richard Summers' 3rd Battalion, Gloucester County Militia. And in doing the research on the original 3rd Battalion and the people who were in that unit, I sort of came to the discovery that a lot of the things that I was reading at that time were more akin to myth and legend rather than real history. So I started digging in as many primary sources from that period as I could find. Things like period newspapers, military pensions from the time, government documents, court documents, and et cetera, et cetera. And although I'm sure that I still have things to find out there, things to consider, I felt that I had enough information to write a book, and hence my book, Privateers, Pine Robbers, Coastal New Jersey During the American Revolution. Now, when you go digging in a graveyard, you are likely to find skeletons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those skeletons tonight. not the usual topic I would think that the Sons of the American Revolution might be hearing in some of their presentation. Now, I do have some of my books available here tonight. If you'd like to purchase a book, you can see my lovely wife, Judy, over here. And if you give her $20, she will give you a copy of my book. Are you going to see any of that? and just for tonight, I decided to dig out some of my old reenactment uniforms and put them on. And amazingly, after almost 50 years, my hat and my shoes still fit. Now, I will give you a warning that if you're looking for a fun beach read, do not buy this book. Okay? I wanted to find out what the real history was behind some of the events that occurred in coastal New Jersey during the American Revolution. Now, this was, and I forget who contacted me first, whether it was Mike or Paul or somebody, but they said, what's your topic going to be? And I sort of, I don't know, I blurted this out electronically that this was going to be the topic. But as I started to prepare my presentation, I thought, it's really not such a good topic. I think this would be a better topic for what I'm going to be talking about tonight. A controversy at Little Egg Harbor and a revelation, a sort of bonus at the end. And these all, the sources for this talk are all found in the Admiralty trials of the schooner Dolphin and the sloop Diamond. And they took place between 1782 and 1784. Now, I have to give you a little bit of background before I get into the heart of the story. I'm going to try to breeze through that as fast as I can. We know that during the American Revolution, privateering along the Jersey coast developed into a boom business. Not only was the Wi-Fi booming, but privateering was booming. Anyway, you have to make commercials. But anyway, throughout the course of the conflict, hundreds of privateer vessels manned by thousands of crewmen could be found privateering along the Jersey coast, interdicting British shipping going into and out of British-occupied New York City. Now, one of my pet peeves is historians who equate privateering with piracy. I would say that is not the case. They were two different animals. Another one of my pet peeves is historians who call privateers legalized pirates. Sorry, that's an oxymoron. You cannot be legal and a pirate at the same time. So, no, I don't buy that. What was the difference between privateering and pirates? It was all of the rules and regulations which the government formulated to regulate privateering. You had to get a commission from the government. You had to post bond money to ensure that you were going to play by the rules. And there were all kinds of rules about how the vessels that privateers captured, how they would be handled. And at the middle, or at the central core of privateering, were the admiralty courts. If a privateer captured another vessel, and in privateering nomenclature, that vessel would be known as a prize. If a privateer captured a prize, it had to bring it into to court immediately. It could not take anything out of the privateer. It had to preserve, or the prize, it had to preserve the prize exactly as it was when it was captured. And it had to report the capture to the Admiralty. And that would trigger a series of events that would lead to that prize being tried in an Admiralty court. And in New Jersey, that was done before a judge and a jury. If the participants in that trial were not happy with the outcome, they could appeal the state's ruling to a higher court. And that was a special court set up by the Continental Congress, the Court of Appeals in cases of capture. Now, unfortunately, New Jersey's Admiralty Court records have disappeared. But some fragments of those records exist in the records of the Court of Appeals. And those will be the basis, the source for the story that I'm about to tell you tonight. You see the Admiralty seal, the Silver Admiralty seal of New Jersey, which if you go on eBay, you can buy for $6,000. I've reported this to various authorities in New Jersey, but they could care less. So if you have $6,000, you can purchase this seal. Now, the typical New Jersey privateer was either a two-masted schooner or a single-masted sloop. These were small, fast, lightly armed vessels that could take advantage of the sailing conditions along the Jersey coast. But there was even a smaller class of vessels that were used for privateering. And these were called the armed boats. And there were several different types of vessels that were lumped under this title. There were galleys, fairly large galleys that could be rowed by 20 men or more, and they could use oars as well as sails to navigate. There were gunboats such as this that is pictured here, boats that would carry one large cannon and maybe a few swivels. There was even a smaller type of vessel used, and these were armed whaleboats. Boats that could be manned by less than a dozen men and would carry just one or two small swivels and small arms, muskets, pistols, cutlasses, etc. And some of these crews did not have, shall we say, a good reputation. They would sail up to Long Island, plunder the inhabitants on Long Island. Of course, the Tories in Long Island were doing the same thing to us, so it sort of balanced out. But the leaders of the time thought that this kind of predatory warfare was just fanning the flames rather than contributing to the actual fighting in the field. Now, New York City was, as we all know, was occupied by the British throughout the war. And the city was crowded with not only military personnel, but Tory refugees who had fled there for protection. And the inhabitants of the city were always in the need of supplies. They were at the end of a supply line that stretched all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And they were willing to pay hard money for those supplies. So if you were a New Jersey merchant who had access to these needed supplies, things like building materials, naval stores, food, you had a choice. You could sell your merchandise locally and get paid in devalued continental scrip, or you could sell it in New York and get paid hard money and make a big profit in the bargain. Now, there was a major difficulty with that, in that it was unlawful to do so. If you were caught trading with the enemy for obvious reasons, you could get into big trouble. But apparently enough New Jerseyans were willing to take the risk, because the trade, which was called the illicit trade at the time, tempted many New Jerseyans. In order to curb that trade, the New Jersey legislature passed a number of laws throughout the course of the conflict. This is the preamble to one of those laws, one of the earlier laws that was passed, an act to prevent the subjects of this state from going into or coming out of the enemy's lines without permission or passports and for the purposes therein mentioned. Whereas many disaffected subjects of this state do keep up an intercourse and communication with the subjects or troops of the King of Great Britain, highly dangerous to the public safety. Now, as we go along through the war, these laws keep getting passed that are more strict, because they didn't seem to really work. Another law, which you can read there, but in these later laws, you could face the death penalty, especially if you were carrying a wagon load of goods at night towards the shore of New Jersey and you were armed. If you were intercepted, you were going to be in big trouble. Now, the illicit trade was a constant worry for Governor William Livingston. The state did not seem to be able to curb it. And it was probably embarrassing also, because it's his state and it's trouble. And as a result, he would frequently seek assistance from the Continental Congress for more resources to curb the illicit trade. And he would write to Washington several times saying, "Can't you send Continental troops over here to help us with this?" Washington never followed through. He was sympathetic, but he had bigger fish to fry, and he considered it to be a New Jersey problem. Let me just read you a short excerpt from one of the letters that he wrote to Washington in January of 1782. "Dear Sir, by recent advices from Egg Harbor, several armed boats with a number of men are fortifying on Osborne's Island near Egg Harbor for the greater convenience of conveying provisions to New York, which already go from that neighborhood in immense quantities. The vicinity of that part of the state is so disaffected or intimidated that the refugees have long reigned in it with little or no control. And I fear that the enemies lodging themselves there in any strongholds will be the most pernicious consequence. Guards of our militia are, whether from want of pay or what others cause, latterly procured with the greatest difficulty, and when obtained are for the want of proper discipline, often from the insignificance and unfitness of their officers, and not infrequently from their being soon corrupted after being stationed on the lines by the alluring profits of the illicit trade of very little public utility."
No, I'm not. If they don't get to, okay.
Can I just interrupt you for one
Sure.
second? Monica just asked me to tell everybody,
Schemes that the illicit traders dreamed up was something called collusive captures. This was illicit trade that was carried on under the cover of privateering. There were two main ways that this was carried out. One I call the outbound collusive capture. Somebody in New Jersey will say in Little Egg Harbor had a shipload of lumber that they knew would bring a very high price up in New York City. So they would clear that vessel out for the West Indies. However, they would sail instead up to New York. There they would have Confederates that would make sure they could get past the Royal Navy Guard ships that were there. And the cargo would be taken to New York where it could be sold at a healthy profit. Now the other kind of collusive capture would be the inbound. If a merchant up in New York had merchandise that he knew would bring a pretty penny in New Jersey or maybe nearby Philadelphia, they would load up a ship. They would arrange with their Confederates in New Jersey to go up. They would say they were going out on a cruise, a privateering cruise, but instead they would go to New York. They would meet up with their Confederates there. They would sail back with the loaded vessel, claiming that they had captured it, and it would be treated as a prize, sold, and the profits would be shared. Now, are we all familiar with Joseph Ball? Do we know who Joseph Ball is? He was the owner of Batstow. He was a militia officer and was a well-known personality in the Little Egg Harbor area. How about Richard Westcott? Are we familiar with Richard Westcott? He was the owner of an inn, a tavern, a landing, and a store at the forks of the Little Egg Harbor River, which became a famous place where Admiralty sales were held. He was a major in Colonel Richard Summers' 3rd Battalion, Gloucester County Militia, and he was wounded at the Second Battle of Trenton. Now, as I said, the story that I'm going to relate to you comes mainly from the Admiralty records, of the Court of Appeals in the case of the schooner Dolphin and the sloop Diamond. And basically what happened was Captain Nathan Jackson sailed out of Egg Harbor the beginning of December 1782 on a cruise. They went up, according to Captain Jackson, they went up around Long Island looking for prize vessels. They didn't find anything, so they decided to sail up through the Narrows, which is a channel that lies between Staten Island and the western end of Long Island. According to Jackson, they sailed up. They muffled their oars so they wouldn't make any noise. They sailed through the Narrows at night, got past the guard ship undetected, and found a schooner. And they got alongside without being detected, jumped on board and overpowered the crew and took her as a prize, and that was the schooner Dolphin. They detected laying close by was the sloop Diamond, which they also were successful in capturing. They once again got past the guard ship, sailed back to Egg Harbor with their prizes. Unfortunately, as they were crossing the bar, the rough surf upset the Greyhound, the galley Greyhound that they were using. She was being towed by the Dolphin, and the Greyhound was lost. Now, an Admiralty court date was set for January 31st, 1783. The Honorable Admiralty Judge John Imlay presided. The court was to be held at the Inn of Francis Witt in Trenton. The jury was to be drawn from men residing in Huntington County. Unfortunately, before that trial could be held, all hell broke loose in Little Egg Harbor. On the night of December 19th, 20th, John Bacon and his men raided Little Egg Harbor. Are you familiar with John Bacon? He was an infamous loyalist raider who we would call in this part a pine robber. He and his men got aboard the Diamond and Dolphin as they were laying in the river, overpowered the guards, and attempted to sail them down the river. However, being winter, there was a lot of ice in the river. The going was very slow. They were afraid they weren't going to get out by daybreak, so they went ashore and they accosted Francis Gimmel, who was one of the inhabitants living along the shores of the river. They took his wagons and his small boats. They returned to the Diamond and Dolphin, started unloading the cargo onto the small boats, taking them ashore and putting them in the wagons. Unfortunately for them, Captain Alexander Dickey, who was a sea captain and a privateer captain, was out and about, and he stumbles across the raiders. He fires on them, even though he's greatly outnumbered. He fires on them. The raiders think that this is a militia that has showed up. They abandon their plunder and run into the woods. Soon thereafter, Joseph Ball and a contingent of local militia arrived to assist in securing the cargo. Now, as a result of these actions, Dickey also files a claim in Admiralty Court stating he should be awarded prize money because he recaptured the cargo. Also, Joseph Ball and the militia also filed a claim in Admiralty Court saying that they were the ones who secured part of the cargo. That wasn't the end of it, however. On December 26th, David Foreman, with a posse of 20 men and the Monmouth County Sheriff, suddenly appeared at the Forks. They were looking for illicit traders and those involved in collusive captures. Someone apparently from Little Egg Harbor had tipped off David Foreman that there was some illicit trading going on in Little Egg Harbor. Now, are we familiar with David Foreman? A very controversial figure in New Jersey during the American Revolution. I can't go into why that's the case, but take my word for it. When he wasn't fighting loyalists, which he was famous for, in fact, he led a group called the Monmouth County Associators, sometimes also called the Monmouth County Retaliators. They were a vigilante group known for their zeal in fighting the Tories. So when Foreman was not engaged in fighting loyalists, he was engaged in disputes with his fellow patriots. This is a picture of him after the war when he apparently took up the hobby of eating. So when the Admiralty trial finally opened in Trenton, there were actually 4 contenders for the prizes, the Dolphin and Diamond and their cargoes. And their cargoes was made up a lot of British merchandise, which was quite expensive. There was Nathan Jackson, who was the original libellant in the Admiralty case, the one who claimed that he had captured the 2 vessels. There was Alexander Dickey, who, as a claimant, said he should get some of the prize money because he had recaptured from the refugees the cargoes. There was Joseph Ball and the militia, who claimed they should get some of the prize money because they had helped secure some of the cargo. And there was David Foreman, who claimed he should get the prize money because these vessels had been involved as part of a collusive capture. This is an image of one of the actual jury decisions, this one for the schooner Dolphin. But what it reads is that on January 33rd, 1783, in the case of the schooner Dolphin, the jury found the facts in the claims of both David Foreman and Alexander Dickey were true, and the facts of Captain Nathan Jackson's bill were not true. The next day, they found that the claims of David Foreman and Alexander Dickey were true, and the claim of Joseph Ball was not true. Nathan Jackson and Joseph Ball immediately filed appeals to carry their cases over to the Continental Congress's Court of Appeals in cases of capture. Jackson's appeal was registered March 16, 1783, but there's no evidence that Ball actually followed through with his claim or with his appeal. So what you had was a trial in the appeals court, which was a free-for-all, no holds barred, legal slugfest. There was accusations of perjury, and these charges flew back and forth from both sides. Accusations of perjury, witness tampering, evidence tampering, bribery, fraud, and character assassination. However, not only was the fate of the prizes Diamond and Dolphin on the line, so were reputation, especially at Little Lake Harbor. The appeals case would drag on for over a year. The written records of the trial would stretch to over 800 pages. Pages of testimonies, depositions, and other legal documents. Unfortunately, there is no transcript of what actually the oral arguments were that occurred during the trial. And this makes deciphering what was actually going on quite difficult. A lot of reading between the lines has to be done to try to figure out what actually is happening. However, looking at the records of the case, one thing is clear. Nathan Jackson had at least 2 partners, maybe 3, and they were James Summers, Richard Westcott, and probably Joseph Ball. If Richard Westcott was involved, then probably Joseph Ball was also, because they were great business partners. Now, while much of the proceedings were resolved around the actual facts of who did what and Was the Greyhound in New York? Was it a collusive capture? Was it a legitimate capture? Et cetera, et cetera. It soon became clear that what David Foreman was trying to do with his case was prove that Summers, Westcott, and Ball were involved in the illicit trade. In the end, the Court of Appeals upheld the New Jersey Admiralty Court ruling. David Foreman's claim was allowed to proceed. However, that meant that Jackson, and by implication, Summers, Richard Westcott, and Joseph Ball were guilty of being involved in illicit trade. Now, reading the testimony that occurred during the trial, it's clear that many of Joseph Ball's neighbors and Richard Westcott's neighbors did not think too highly of them. Benjamin Brush was an inn and tavern keeper at the Forks of the Little Egg Harbor, a neighbor of Richard Westcott. And during the trial, he was asked a question: what has been the general character of Colonel Richard Westcott and Joseph Ball for 3 or 4 years before the peace, as illicit traders or otherwise? His answer: their general character has been that of traders with the enemy. Abraham Davis, a resident of Chestnut Neck, the witness being asked whether he knew Colonel Westcott and Joseph Ball and what the general characters of Richard Westcott and Joseph Ball were, answered he knows them both well, and their general characters for several years last past has been that they have carried on an illicit trade with New York by collusive captures and otherwise. John Davis, who was captain of the New Jersey State Troops stationed at Chestnut Neck, and a true patriot, by the way, John Davis, was asked what the character of Colonel Westcott and Joseph Ball was. And he answered, they are generally reputed to have carried on more of the illicit trade than any other persons in New Jersey. John Foreman, the witness being asked if he is acquainted with Colonel Richard Westcott and Joseph Ball, answered he was acquainted with them both. Being asked their general characters as illicit traders, he answered, general reports say they have for several years carried on an illicit trade by collusive captures and otherwise. Timothy Shaler was asked, what is the general report of Colonel Richard Westcott and Joseph Ball as illicit traders or otherwise? They were in the illicit trade during part of the war. Have you or not heard it generally reported that they, the said Richard Westcott and Joseph Ball, had some vessels during the war loaded with lumber, tar, etc., and cleared out for different ports, when they were in fact contracted for to be taken by the British in New York? Answer, I have heard it so said generally, but I do not know it. And he goes on to elaborate on some other things he's heard about them at Little Egg Harbor. Nonetheless, a personage then, David Brearley, the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, was called to give testimony in this case. He was asked what is now and has been the general character of Joseph Ball and Richard Westcott of Egg Harbor respecting the illegal trade to New York by collusive captures and otherwise? His answer: in the early part of the war, their characters stood fair, but sometime in the year 1780, as nearly as I can recollect, a discovery was made by the executive of Pennsylvania of extensive illicit trade being carried on between the cities of Philadelphia and New York through New Jersey, which executive has transmitted to the executive of New Jersey divers affidavits and papers charging several persons in New Jersey with participating in this business, amongst whom the said Joseph Hall and Richard Westcott were charged with being largely concerned, and since that time they have had the reputation of being in that trade. So that's just some of the behind-the-scenes things that were going on at Little Egg Harbor during the war. However, I found something very interesting in these testimonies, something that doesn't necessarily directly have anything to do with the illicit trade, but concerns the massacre at Long Beach Island, which took place October 25th, 1782. A British vessel had run aground on Long Beach Island, the northern part of Long Beach Island, around what is today Barnegat Light. She was taken possession of by the crew of the galley Alligator, according to accounts. That vessel was under the command of Captain Andrew Steelman. He and his men went to the beach. They started to unload the stranded vessel's cargo. It was late at night. They got tired. They went to sleep on the beach. Word got out to the pine robber, John Bacon, that they were there. He and his men crossed over, and according to the one account that I found, Steelman and his men were massacred. When I started looking to find what was the official record behind this massacre, I could only come up with one thing, and it seems to be the primary source for the details of the massacre, and that was a newspaper account printed in a loyalist newspaper in New York City. And that paper was James Rivington's Royal Gazette, or as the Patriots like to call it, Jimmy Rivington's Loyal and Royal Lion Gazette. But in reading through the Admiralty trials of the Diamond and Dolphin, I made an interesting discovery. One of the people called to give their testimony during the trial was none other than Colonel Richard Summers. Apparently he was appearing as a character witness for James Summers. And I don't know the connection between the two of them, other than they served in the militia together. I don't know if they were relatives or not. I always thought that James Summers was Richard Summers' brother, but I'm not sure of that. I don't know if there's anybody here that has knowledge of the Summers family tree. Please see me after. As part of his testimony, for some reason, Richard Summers talks about what happened on Long Beach Island. Again, as part of his testimony, he states, the galley Rainbow of Egg Harbor, commanded by Andrew Steelman, was partly owned by me. Now, in the other reports in Rivington's Gazette, it names the galley as the Alligator, but Summers is clearly stating here that it was called the Rainbow. She was captured by the enemies of the United States by a party under the command of one Bacon, as I was informed. At this time, David Skull was lieutenant of the Rainbow, as I was informed when she was fitted out. The manner of the capture, as I was told at the time, that the Rainbow had chased a vessel ashore in view of the previous circumstances, were thus related to me at the time. The first accounts were that a vessel appearing in sight off Egg Harbor, the Rainbow went out after her, and it was generally said it was likely she, the Rainbow, was taken. The next accounts were that the Rainbow had driven the vessel on shore, that she was a cutter, and that the Rainbow's people were saving her cargo, and that they had employed a number of inhabitants to save the goods. The next account was that some of the hired hands from the shore had gone and informed Captain Bacon, a refugee, and joined him with his party, and then gone to the beach where Captain Steelman had been saving the cutter's cargo, and shot Captain Steelman and one of his crew dead, and wounded Lieutenant David Skull while lying at a fire at some distance from the Rainbow, and then that they went and took the Rainbow and the rest of her crew. So some interesting details about the Long Beach Island found in the records of the Court of Appeals. That concludes my formal part of the presentation. Thank you very much for having me. If anybody has any questions, I can try to answer them.
We have time for a few quick questions. So anybody have anything?
Stumped everybody. Did you happen to see any records in the New Jersey Supreme Court files? I found some cases with privateers in my family that were in the New Jersey Supreme Court after the war, where guys were sued to get their,
One of the things I'd really like to do is, for instance, what happened to Westcott and Ball and James Summers. If they were really involved in the illicit trade, there didn't seem to be any consequences for that. Of course, that wouldn't be handled by the Admiralty Court. That would be handled by some other kind of civil court.
I got one question. The Admiralty Court, which you talked about, that was set up primarily before our federal court system, which was started 1789.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, it was set up.
Now, who appointed the judges?
The Continental Congress.
Continental Congress. Okay.
Any other questions?
Originally, the Continental Congress tried to handle these cases as a body. That didn't work. There was too many of them. They couldn't, they didn't have enough time to do it. They tried using a special committee. That didn't work either. And they finally set up the Court of Appeals.
Question. North of here, from Gloucester up to Mount Desert, where would claims have been handled? Would there be an Admiralty Court up in Maine, or
Each state was supposed to establish its own admiralty.
Okay.
So each one of the 13 colonies would have its own admiralty court. I'm not sure whether they all actually did that or not, but they were supposed.
Anything else?
Yeah, I just have a question. Where are those Admiralty Court papers held?
In the National Archives. But if you want to read them, are you familiar with Fold 3? Yeah, Fold 3. I believe it's Fold 3. You'll find most of the cases on Fold 3.
One more question, if anybody has a question. Tim? Nothing? Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, Bob.